My name is Dr. Michelle McMillan. I am a assistant professor in the English department here at NC State. And I'm very excited to be joined by colleagues of mine from University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Adam Mickiewicz of University in Poland to talk to you about CROW, which is a research project that started for us at Purdue as graduate students in 2015. We started with a team of 2 faculty and about 7 graduate students, and now have a team of more than 30 at more than 6 institutions around the country and around the world. So CROW is, did we get to the next slide? We did.
Yeah.
CROW is really 2 things, and we are going to talk a little bit about both of them today. CROW is a digital platform for corpus research that's linked with a repository of pedagogical materials for writing studies research and teaching. It's also this very large interinstitutional and interdisciplinary team that builds, maintains, and grows the CROW platform. So we're going to talk about CROW work in a few different ways today. We want to talk about the corpus and how that data and interface supports inclusive research and teaching. We also want to talk about constructive distributed work, which is the name we have given to the heuristic we use for team building and project management, and how user experience informs the kind of assessment that helps us understand how our methods support ethical, inclusive, sustainable research practices. So I am going to turn over to Dr. Swatek, who will talk about the corpus.
Yeah, first of all, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really happy that Michelle invited me to talk about the CROW project. And I'm the applied linguist in the group, and I study writing and applied linguistics, and I'm really passionate about corpus work. And I would like to talk a little bit about the value of corpus work for inclusive research and teaching, and specifically for equity. So what is a corpus and what is our corpus? So you might know the word corpus from just everyday language, but when we think about corpus in applied linguistics, it's a collection of texts that includes authentic language. It's also includes texts that are representative of certain domain. So if you're thinking about first-year writing, we want to make sure that there aren't any texts that don't come from a first-year writing context. It's also a balanced data set, so we don't want there to be an overrepresentation of maybe like one type of assignment and maybe just one sample from another type of assignment. And when we think about designing corpora, so these data sets that are supposed to represent a certain language variety or certain register, we always use explicit criteria. We think about, before collecting the data set, we really think about carefully who we want to represent, what kind of language we want to represent. So our corpus, the CROW corpus, is a corpus of first-year writing from the United States. We currently have about over 11,000 samples and over 10 million words. We have texts that were collected from fall 2009 through spring to 2020. It's also a corpus of students who come from not only from the US, but mostly from countries all over the world. So there is metadata that is attached to every text in our corpus, and this metadata shows what country the student comes from, their gender, the assignment that they wrote, the date when the text was written, and the TOEFL score of the student. And we have students from 58 countries in our corpus. There are over 32 genres in the corpus, so we have such texts as literacy narratives, annotated bibliography, and genre analysis. And even though we have 32 different genres, they only come from 3 institutions. So you can kind of see how in first-year writing, there's really a diversity of different types of assignments that faculty teach or instructors teach. So really, like earlier in the day, we were thinking about or talking about linguistic diversity and gatekeeping in academia. And I think that really the value of corpora, and when we think about writing and corpora, is showing what is the language that students are actually using when they write in the first year classrooms, rather what we think they should be writing or what is the standard English. The value of our corpus is to give access to the instructors or students or researchers to look at the actual language that is produced, I would say, in the classrooms. And alongside of our corpus, there is also a repository. So we're not only looking at student texts, but we're also looking at what kind of assignments the teachers are giving to the students. And so the repository is a repository of pedagogical materials that are used in the same courses where we collect corpus texts. And the texts in the corpus are linked to the materials in the repository. So if you come across maybe a literacy narrative and you're interested to see what is the response, where does this text come from? Like, what was the prompt that the student was given to write this particular text? You can click and see the sample assignment and see how these are linked in our repository in Corpus. And the current size of the repository is listed here. You can see 142 assignments or activities. We have over 100 assignment sheets, lesson plans, rubrics, etc. So it's a really big kind of data set, again, that is linked to another data set. And if you are curious to see, like, what does the corpus look like, you can look at our interface here and see on the left side the menu, and you can filter through the metadata that I was talking about, so the institution where the text is coming from, the year, etc. And here in the middle, so you can see the sample texts, and if you're like curious to maybe find some phrase that the students are using in their writing, you can input it in the search bar and kind of get the results here and see how the students are using certain language. But you can also just say, well, I want to see all the literacy narratives, so you can choose it in the assignment here. So this is the corpus interface, but we also have a repository interface, which is very similar to what is here. You'll see in the repository interface on the left side, you'll see like the assignment prompt. This is actually not the right slide, but it's the same visual. So you'll be able to like preview and download the assignment sheet, look at the syllabus, etc., and see connected texts. One maybe thing that I will mention is that we have multiple drafts of the same paper. So students oftentimes in the first year writing course will write multiple drafts, and you can see how students were developing their arguments or their paper over time, and kind of do research on that too. So maybe I'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of the key discussions that are happening around writing instruction and how I think our project meets the challenge that writing instruction is facing in terms of inclusivity and equity. So there is a lot of discussion about monolingual models in writing instruction. And earlier in the day, we were also like hearing about standard language ideology, standard English language ideology, the idea that students should be producing this one monolingual type of writing language that is standard and I would say white, right? So Crow responds to this challenge by providing anyone who is interested with the access to authentic curated texts and pedagogical materials, including sample activities, which engage instructors and students with texts of diverse multilingual writers. And I would also say that the curricula, especially at the University of Arizona, are informed by the most recent research in social linguistics, applied linguistics. So the critique maybe of standard English ideology and just embrace of the diverse resources that students are bringing to the classrooms are already present in the pedagogical materials and in the student texts. So anyone can access that and kind of think through together or work with these texts to see how monolingual ideology is kind of challenged in that. Another element is thinking about deficit models, and that is something that is plaguing language instruction. So whenever we have learners of English, the focus is always often on error. And whenever we're presenting across different conferences, there's always someone asking us if we're tagging the errors of students in their papers to learn about like how much error is there in the corpus. So that's a very good example of when thinking about learners are people who are making errors, and we have to focus on these errors and like eliminate them. And in our corpus and our team is really thinking about asset-oriented models of language learning. So promoting learner text as models for other language learners. So we're imagining that multilingual students can come to our corpus and read texts of other multilingual writers. So see that you don't have to be a native speaker to really be a good writer, or a proficient writer, or a writer that is very effective in communication. And we also want to focus on functional language use, so thinking about how students are using different language features functionally, and just generally kind of challenge this deficit model. And when we think about the repository, we want to also show how pedagogical materials can challenge monolingual bias and standard language ideologies, and kind of give access to maybe instructors who don't have that much time of writing their own activities or syllabi, and they want to look at some good examples and maybe borrow something. We're very open to that. So our assignments in the repository show that instructors can weave in linguistic research and attune students to work across genres and linguistic variation, and they model inclusive approach to language and linguistic diversity. So now I will pass on the presentation back to Michelle.
Thank you.
She can talk about how we work as researchers. So moving on, we are working on the corpus, and how do we work on this project?
So one of the things that we addressed early when we thought about the problems we wanted to address for corpus researchers and writing research, and for teaching and creating repositories of materials for teaching and mentoring, when we looked for examples, when we did our environmental scans to see how other people were doing this work, the most consistent problem that we found was sustainability. Faculty move on to other projects, graduate students graduate, funding runs out, and what have been robust tools that were not only useful to an institution but to a field stagnate or break down or don't get updated anymore. So one of the things we really thought about from the beginning was, what does sustainable work in this area? How do we create a platform and a space that will withstand faculty changing institutions, which happened in the first year of our design cycle, that withstands graduate students moving on to other projects and undergraduate researchers moving in and out. So from the beginning, how we work is as important as what we make, which has always been sort of the place I live in our CRO team. I am the infrastructure conscience of our project. Attention to sustainability, effective research results, that we are responsive to change, both in our diverse team and in the needs of the stakeholders and partners that we engage. And how can we be effective across a distributed network of institutions, researchers, and users? Like I said, from year 2 of our design cycle, one of our main faculty investigators moved from Purdue to University of Arizona. So we became an interinstitutional project much earlier than we intended, and had to think through what that means in terms of how we work. So we have termed that approach to work and project management and team building constructive distributed work. And it really functions on a sort of integrated approach that has 3 dimensions. So core principles that ground our work, that come from scholarship and are based in research and theory, best practices that are processes, methods, activities grounded in those core principles, and orientations to work that help us understand how our best practices operationalize our core principles. So I'm going to run through these a little bit on their own and then talk about them as sort of how we use them as an integrative approach, both to project management and to assessment, to see if we're keeping our word about the things we say we're doing. So none of the tools or things that we do, concepts, approaches used in constructive distributed work are not necessarily new. Digital team communication platforms, Google Docs, collaborative work, a lot of the ways that we work together, and even some of the theory that underpins our work is not necessarily new, but thinking about them as integrated and iterative is new, we think is transferable, and is a method for addressing structural inequalities in institutional research teams, not just for us, but in ways that we are excited to share and test and grow in new ways. So, did I get too far? I did. I like this. So core principles. For us, our core principles are that we develop rhetorical confidence for team members and cultivate their ability to argue for the value of their work and to advocate for themselves. We use a networked model for mentoring. Much of current research and literature about mentoring has talked about the need for understanding networks and the systemic inequalities often embedded in our systems of traditional mentoring. So focusing on networked, peer, horizontal, and hierarchical mentoring is very important to us. And attention to infrastructure, keeping infrastructure visible, embeds reflection and iteration in team activities. Infrastructure is most visible when it's broken. So the more we keep it visible as part of our approach to work, the more opportunities we have for intervention and response at a local level before things break. So our best practices are developed over time and are sort of the larger framework for how we think about day-to-day work and how we train and orient Crow researchers to be part of our team. So these best practices, we've boiled them down to 6, and they get represented in lots of different ways in day-to-day activities. But confront the rhetorical challenges inherent in distributed work, coordinate, consolidate, and archive distributed work with a team communication platform, teach collaborative writing strategies, help team members establish cohesive professional identities as they shift between roles and tasks, prioritize individual learning even when new skills and competencies don't directly benefit the team, and reflect carefully when adapting writing practices from software development. These best practices are ones that have developed to support how we understand professional development, how we orient teams. Best practices aren't always universal, they're always situated and evolve over time. But these have some, we think, generalizable principles that are useful. Orientations to work help us illustrate the integrated nature of constructive distributed work. And articulating them can help teams see where best practices and core principles are actually informing how teams function. So understanding how we think about orientations to work happens best all together. So our orientations to work are approach, activity, and outcome. So approach is methods, tools, rules, and strategies. Activity is labor, tasks, tactics, actions. Outcomes are concrete material benefits, products, achievements for both individuals and for our teams. So when we think about this as integrated, we spend time thinking about if the best practice that we are engaging is confront rhetorical challenges inherent in distributed work. We approach rhetorical confidence and building it through networked mentoring. And an example of that is when we have leadership meetings and when we build leadership teams and projects, we explicitly address and make sure that there are those networked mentoring opportunities between undergraduate and graduate students, between faculty, across disciplines and fields, so that we are building opportunities based on what students care about and what their interests are for networked mentoring. When we think about it in rhetorical challenges in terms of activity, this is usually reflected in engagement with infrastructure. So, for example, new team members will do a review and comment pass on something like an explainer or a best practices document, so that we get to see how they interact and understand the infrastructure that supports our work, and they get an opportunity to understand that we value how they comment and talk about our processes, and that we're open to revision and iteration from every place in our team. This is the place where we're coming to a transition, and I get to hand off to Hadi. But one of the things that's important about thinking about confront rhetorical challenges as an outcome is to think about how we assess team members' confident participation in the complex, mediated conversations that are career work that happens on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things we're very excited about is not just that we can say this is a thing we do, and that it works for us, but that we can offer methods for assessment to show how we're keeping our word and how this work might translate to other contexts. So this is where I get to hand off to Hadi.
Thank you, Dr. McMullen. I'm Hadi Banat. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I direct the English as a second language program. I've been in Crow since its inception, working with Dr. McMullen and Dr. Svetik. And my role in this presentation is to emphasize that the constructive distributed work is not only a heuristic that focuses on praxis. It's not a heuristic that focuses on helping us coordinate work, but it's also a heuristic that achieves, like our purpose for assessment, and also our approach to research and to designing methods that allow us to think of our work as data-driven and to validate our work as data-driven. So I'm quoting our previous publication in SIGDoc here. In designing our research methods for assessment, we borrow from software development and user experience design to build reflective personas which help us evaluate how we design things in Crow without limiting our assessment to the quality of what we make. So we don't think of the product. The product in this case is, yes, the interface, but it's a sustainable product because it's growing. And to have a sustainable product, we need to think of a sustainable team that is behind this important work. So on this slide, I'm in general showing, our UX-driven approach to a CDW assessment. So in Crow, at the beginning, as Michelle mentioned, we benefited from environmental scans of, previous or existing corpora and repository projects. And Dr. McMullen talked about, one important lesson that we've learned, which is sustainability. So we didn't want to design the Crow platform according to imaginary personas or according to model personas. We wanted to reach out to teachers, to students, to writing program administrators, and to writing researchers. So we are inclusive in the way we are doing our outreach, because all of these are important stakeholders, and all of these are potential users of our platform. For these audiences to go through user testing, we were very purposeful in eliciting organized feedback through direct observations, follow-up surveys, and interviews. So we're thinking of documentation not only in terms of how we work, but also in terms of our data collection methods. Based on this data, and based on our analysis of this data, we developed different user personas for our Crow team members, but also user personas for our partners in other institutions. And after developing these user personas, we learned more that, like if we are evaluating and if we are improving the way we work and if we're improving our products, we have to think of purposeful design and iterative design. And the lessons that we are learning are reshaping both the platform, the interface, and also the way we work. So from these lessons, we were also kind of influenced by the methodology of user design thinking and the way we are evaluating our team internally. So the theory about UXD thinking and user design thinking when it comes to assessment transferred to how we are doing internal assessment. And when we were approaching internal assessment, we were certain that participatory design research enhances the assessment of diverse users even within the same team, because within our population, we do have undergraduate student users, graduate student users, and faculty users. But even in an interdisciplinary team, we see a lot of diverse users under each representative persona. We were also very purposeful about investigating users' tacit knowledge. And in the process of assessment, we also knew that iteration and recursion are inevitable, are important, and definitely demand from us a certain level of attention. When we think of design thinking methodology, it does reframe messiness, especially when we think about all the gaps that we see as we are evaluating. But evaluating these gaps also help us identify problems and tackle these problems by responsive solutions. Also, when we're thinking of internal assessment, we're including everyone, we're flattening hierarchy, and this is how we make our assessment methodology more inclusive. So when we collected data from the team, we designed interview questions with Quisenberry's model in mind, and we conducted discourse-based interviews with various Crow researchers. And when we were conducting these discourse-based interviews, we used our material, social, and artifactual infrastructures to facilitate the interviews and to activate different users' memory in order to tell us how their experiences were in collaboration and how their experiences were in dealing and using our infrastructure. So after we collected discourse-based interview data from different users, we developed a reflexive coding scheme that helped us analyze the raw interview data. So as researchers on the team, we relied on our ethnographic lived observations, especially that we have memory of the project since its inception. We examined verbatim statements from interview data, and we also used the Quisenberry model to develop axial thematic codes. And here I'm focusing on that just to emphasize that our theoretical orientations to work are always informing our research methods and our assessment methods. So from this raw data, we developed aggregate personas to represent our undergraduate, graduate, and faculty users. So when we were conducting the discourse-based interviews, we asked questions on users' descriptions of Crow context and environments, because we wanted to see how each user is describing these environments with a focus on the different types of infrastructures. We also asked about their decision-making during collaboration, about their responses to the activities that Dr. McMullen mentioned, especially when we work in collaborative environments and with collaborative technological tools, about their interpretations of peers' activities and behaviors, their responses to the affordances and constraints of both infrastructure and collaboration. And the anecdotal stories that they told us helped us see the way we work through their own diverse lenses. So when I talked about Quisenberry model, it basically helped us developed the 6 axial codes, or the 6 main categories for each representative persona. The personal characteristics that focused on demographic data, the goals and tasks of each user, their motivations, their dispositions, their ways of thinking, the way they think of constraints, their attitudes and needs with respect to Crow and with respect to their future professional development, the stories that they told us, and quotes, as in like specific language from participants that eliminated their experiences as well. In the last section of my part of the presentation, we wanted to show you a representative graduate student persona, Noor Fares, who's a Purdue University graduate student in English, heard about Crow from a peer in their first year and was interested in the unique nature and interdisciplinary approach of the Crow team. This user values both research and teaching, studies rhetoric and composition, but uses corpus-based analysis and research. They were primarily interested in Crow for research because we know that graduate coursework and PhD programs don't focus so much on research, focuses more on theory. This user helped us write an internal grant in a supporting role, then had a larger role in writing an external grant, including participation and decision making. Discussed learning about grants and budgets outside the context of Crow. So we see a user who's transferring expertise from Crow to other spaces. They have a strong sense of ethics and want academic work to be motivated by it. They're comfortable with learning by doing. They value receiving feedback and giving feedback, so the reciprocal model. They enjoy working collaboratively, but they also have a need for the role to be defined, especially in a busy collaborative environment, and whether this collaborative environment is in person or as they are working on collaborative writing docs like Google Docs. So here we see also, like a representative quote, working with Crow let me explore the intellectual communities I wanted to join in preparation to professionalization. Writing grants helped me see how obscure genres like budget justifications were connected to real practices. I felt like I was learning how to collaborate and learning how to make an argument for teamwork too. I was learning how grants could fit into my vision for being a scholar. In the last section of our presentation, we're focusing on Crow in action, how our methods support ethical, inclusive, sustainable research practices, and we're thinking of these practices as takeaways that potentially can transfer to your own collaborative research teams and departments. So here I want to focus on why the repository. The repository of pedagogical materials helps us share resources across communities and institutions. By providing, like well-curated data to conduct research on pedagogy and curricula so that our practice is informed by research and, like helping teacher training programs and helping teacher praxis be supported with authentic data. Try to think how we can share these resources with under-resourced institutions and trying to think how cross-institutional collaboration help us flatten hierarchy in the landscape of the different types of institutions in the US, like finding expertise in practitioners and researchers and community colleges, not only thinking of expertise in terms of R1 institutions. So also this repository supports diverse users with sustainable mentoring, whether these users are temporary writing teachers who are always in a state of flux, as we all know, writing program administrators who are always balancing research, teaching, and administration, long-term career lecturers invested in professionalization, and definitely writing programs that lack relevant human expertise and infrastructural resources. And now I'm going to pass on the floor to Dr. Svetlик, who is going to tell us more about CIABATTA.
Yeah, so I was mentioning earlier that we have a corpus of texts, and I showed you the interface. And CIABATTA is actually the interface code, I would say, for our corpus and repository. And we make that available to anyone or on our GitHub. So if you're thinking about building your own corpus and your own repository, and you don't necessarily have support from your institution, you can come to us and you can come to our GitHub and use the code that we have, source code, that was developed by our developers, Dr. Pickerel from University of Arizona and Mark Fulmer, who have been informing this work for a very long time and been working on this since the beginning. But we also have graduate students and undergraduate students writing tutorials here on GitHub explaining how you can use these different tools if you wanted to build your own corpus. So yet again, I just say that you can go there for examples, design patterns, best practices, and step-by-step processes. But I think at the heart of CIABATTA, our project is this idea that whatever we are doing, we want to share with anyone who's interested and kind of save on their work. And as Hadi mentioned before, when we think about developing the interface, developing the repository, just developing the corpus itself, we always look for feedback. So whether it's workshop attendees at conferences or Crow Fellows. So Crow Fellows is actually a program that we started last year where we invited scholars from underrepresented communities who are, or institutions, who are interested in developing their corpus-based teaching, learning more about how you can use corpus in writing instructions. And we have a course that they are taking, and they receive mentoring from the faculty in the Crow project. And so we have Crow Fellows who are learning about corpus and Crow, and they also provide us with feedback. And as we work ourselves on the corpus and repository, we also see what we would like to improve, and we work collaboratively to change and improve the interface. And another team in our Crow group is the outreach group, where we want to share best practices, also our pedagogical knowledge and research knowledge with anyone who is interested. So we partner with institutions. We have K-12 partnerships in Arizona where members of our team work with teachers who want to learn more about corpus-based instruction, and also maybe these teachers don't necessarily know how academic writing looks like, and they can use the corpus to kind of think about working with their students who will later on transition to college. We have higher education institutions, so not only the partners we have in Crow that we've mentioned earlier, but we're developing partnerships with community colleges to kind of think about how the needs of different stakeholders can inform the development of our corpus. We, of course, give workshops and academic conferences and invited talks, but we also have a YouTube channel. So if you are interested in using the CIABATTA tools, or if you are interested in, for example, grant writing, you can find information about that on our YouTube channel. And I think I'll pass this to Michelle.
I think, yes, this is me. So one of the things that we have done, we are in, what did we say, year 7, 15 to 22?
Or 8.
Or 8, somewhere in there, of Crow development cycles. And in the last 2 years, we really refocused what our public-facing and outward goals are so that we are accountable to them, not just internally, but as we write grant applications, as we work within our institutions. So those goals highlight continuing to recruit a diverse undergraduate and graduate research team, which we have had lots of luck doing over the years and will continue to do. As Ola talked about, we are building relationships with partner institutions and scholars with a focus on diversity and on institutions with different student populations and with different levels of resources, really thinking about how we leverage our resources to support a range of institutions. We have started Crow Fellows. Our pilot program included 4 Crow Fellows for mentoring and pedagogical support. And we are at the place where we are have been evaluating our own CDW methods for a while and are now ready to start looking for research teams and partners that are interested in thinking about how an integrated and sustained approach to project management can help make their own teams more resilient and more diverse. A main factor in that for us is grant writing. Grant writing is a centerpiece for Crow Team for lots of reasons. Funding helps us address the material ways that labor is often invisible and unpaid, particularly when it comes to student researchers. Ethical labor practices we think are important for diversity initiatives, because if we are ethical in how we can staff and pay the people who work on our team, we can recruit a wider range of students who can afford to spend time with us. Sharing our research through partnerships with other institutions is also necessary. Grant writing, when we have money and when we have options, we can build those relationships and share them. Also, we have found that teaching grant writing is an important opportunity for professional development and participatory design. In our keynote this morning, talking about NSF and access and awareness as things that limit diversity for things like NSF. There's also a lot of hidden curriculum, which we all have experienced as former graduate students that are now junior faculty, who can all talk persuasively about how grant writing and being involved in the administrative part of a research project helped us understand how to professionalize, how to think of ourselves confidently as researchers that could pursue grant funding for a variety of different projects, not just the ones supported by our faculty PIs. So we have some questions to help sort of generate conversation, but we are also open to your questions and conversations about distributed work or about Corpus or about anything really.
I'm curious if you've seen times where inequities have surfaced in ways that have challenged this project management process, challenge your research. I'd just love to hear you speak into those kind of bubbling inequities that may have emerged over time.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll go and then you go.
Okay.
We absolutely have, and it's one of the reasons that we have understood it as a focus, because we are a diverse team from both disciplinary and racial and national perspectives. There's lots of different ways that our team interacts, and we've had to address things like cultural differences in communication, in what it means to have leadership conversations that are peer conversations. So I'll let Ola and Hadi speak to this as well, but talking about these challenges openly with our leadership when we were all graduate students, and now as a leadership team that continues to work on this project, part of what keeping infrastructure visible for us means is addressing those bottlenecks openly.
Yeah, I would add that I was an international graduate student at Purdue, so that is a very special experience, and I would say that probably like half of our team or bigger part of our team was international students, and while Crow is an amazing opportunity, and the mentoring that we always received was above and beyond, and everybody worked above and beyond to accommodate this. There are certain ways that American institutions are structured, and higher education institutions and universities, that would prevent us from even, either getting paid or, the we were limited in some ways sometimes in the ways we could work, or even after graduation too. So that's the international student perspective. And I would also say that just in general, because where we were and where we work at, and how, like, for example, applied linguistics looks like, there isn't enough even graduate students, diverse graduate students to recruit. So we try as best as we can to provide these opportunities, but because we're hosted in higher education institutions that look a certain way, and the programs are set up a certain way, that's a challenge too. So we, now we have Crow Fellows, and we are working with faculty from across the U.S., but I see a big challenge in applied linguistics and English and rhetoric and composition to not even having enough graduate students, diverse graduate students, recruiting them and retaining them to kind of enrich just these conversations.
I think in my role in Crow, I was like thinking of inequity in terms of focusing on one particular group. So I brought in my research on intercultural competence to voice that difference does not always focus on one or two races, because we know that there is so much focus even in scholarship and rhetoric and composition. Like when we're thinking of diversity, we're thinking of African American voices, we're thinking of Latinx voices, which is great, but then we are also diluting and limiting the concept of difference to race and to representations of race. So what about the other like diverse elements under the concept of difference, and why they matter, and how they are represented in our team, in our Crow team, and how do we talk about these differences, and how do we listen to these differences, and how do we spot these differences and respond to them effectively, was a constant conversation. And at some point, there was like conflicts, but like when we think of conflicts, we think of how to address these conflicts and how to mentor each other. And I think that's the value of an interdisciplinary team, because each one of us is taking their expertise from Crow to other spaces, but also bringing their expertise from other spaces into Crow to learn collaboratively. Thank you.
I also think we because we work in an interdisciplinary space, we could have low stakes disagreements that taught us how to negotiate conflict and help us set ground rules. I remember a very early conversation with a colleague who is not here, Dr. Ashley Joetta, who is at University of Washington now, about the difference between a corpus and an archive. And we thought about it for days writing a grant proposal. But it taught us something important about how we talk to each other, and something that we could go back to when more serious conflicts came up, or when questions of how do we articulate, how do we assert ourselves as leaders, or how do we speak up if we feel like we have been disrespected in one situation by a partner that we were working with from another institution. Building rhetorical confidence in one area helps us translate it to other contexts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone out in the wide world that has questions for us?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
What?
I don't think there are any more questions.
I don't think so either.
You mentioned you're looking for the next research team to kind of apply this distributed.
Yes?
What's your ideal next?
Hadi and I have talked about this quite a bit, because this is where
What's your ideal next research team that you'd like to study?
the ideal next research team that we would like to work with. Crow is an interesting team because we live at this strange intersection of humanities and social science, where we are not quite humanities enough for humanities scholars and not quite scientific enough for social science scholars. So I think we're really looking for those opportunities to think about how other social scientists or other teams working in the sciences, where sort of the hierarchical nature of labs can be very difficult for graduate students to navigate, and can also make labs very dependent on one faculty member for sustainability. So I think we are looking for faculty and graduate students that are interested in thinking about what collaborative work looks like in those spaces, and how we might adapt CDW principles. I know Hadi can talk to this a little bit too. We've talked about this a lot.
Yeah, we're very keen on transferring this to collaborative research labs in the disciplines. Our original thinking was engineering. The engineering is a good context for NC State. At UMass Boston, like engineering is at UMass Dartmouth. So I'm thinking to reach out to a faculty member in chemistry and in biology, because I've noticed that, like sometimes we kind of, when we think of what success is in a collaborative research team, we think of the product, we think of, the grants they win, we think of the publications that they get out. And this is a measure of success, of course. But then who is involved in the grant writing? Who's involved in the manuscript writing? And what the role is for graduate and undergraduate students. So getting into these research labs to do an ethnography, like to be kind of open in the way we are collecting data and seeing what we can, give back to these communities in terms of our learning from our work and the CDW heuristic, and also what we can take from STEM research labs into our own, research groups in the humanities. I think that's our next project. And we see what's a fertile context for collecting data, whether engineering at NC State or.
Yeah, I think what the conversation I have most often when I talk about constructive distributed work or when I talk about infrastructure is, how do you do so many things at once? And my answer is, I don't, we do as a team. And that takes a lot of collaboration and coordination for us to maintain a team that can sort of have lots of different directions that our research and the products we make move. And that kind of collaboration that I think, and interdisciplinary nature, is one of the reasons I was excited to come to State. So 2 years in, pandemic-wise, I'm really thinking about what those relationships might look like.
Yeah, I would encourage you to go with those gut instincts to get into it. Someone who, I spent the first part of my career in engineering and embedded in engineering, studying communication practices. Second part of my career in design studios, studying communication practices. Third part of my career in my home area in communication, studying classroom communication practices. And I'd love to see work that takes what you're doing and looks at those more hierarchical, and having worked with graduate students running a peer mentoring program at the college level that's collaborative with the College of Vet Med, with the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. I hear about the labs, and so I think you would find that fascinating. So I'd encourage you to, I think those are the right gut instincts to pursue the next steps.
Thank you.
Dean Donnells. Yeah, we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you for
Thank
hosting
you.
us. That was really great.